we're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Norman Solomon. Norman Solomon is a nationally syndicated columnist on media and politics. He has appeared as a guest on many media outlets, including the PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News Channel, C-SPAN, Public Radio's Marketplace, and NPR's All Things Considered. His op-ed articles have appeared in a range of newspapers, including The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Newsday, New York Times, Miami Herald, Philadelphia Inquirer, International Herald Tribune, and the Toronto Star. He has written numerous books, including Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, Wizards of Media Oz, Behind the Curtain of Mainstream News, The Power of Babble, The Politician's Dictionary of Buzzwords and Double Talk for Every Occasion, Killing Our Own, The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Radiation. His latest book, Made Love, Got War, Close Encounters with America's Warfare State. And he is here to talk about his book, which has also been made into a documentary film, which had its Seattle premiere last night at the Northwest Film Forum, War Made Easy, How Presidents and Pundits Are Spinning Us to Death. If you would begin, start out, tell us what was the motivation in writing your book, War Made Easy?
Well, in a sense, it had 40 years of incubation. I grew up during the escalation of the war in Vietnam, and so I observed as a teenager what was happening in the news media, and gradually, as I talk about in the film, tried to understand how much of what we were getting was truth and how much was something else. And so, in the past 4 decades, there have been a succession of wars with a pattern of rationales for them through the news media coming from various administrations. And so when I saw the invasion and occupation of Iraq take place in terms of the agenda setting and then the reporting of the warfare in the U.S. news media, actually the first 3 words I wrote of the book were the title, War Made Easy. And in the course of looking back at the history of the last 5 decades, ended up finding patterns that are just very pernicious. I call it a repetition compulsion disorder, and we see that just in the last few days, I would comment. Of course, the classic case with the Vietnam War was the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was distorted by the news media, helped just days later to, with almost no dissent in the House and Senate, bring about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was the closest to a declaration of war that ever came from Congress in terms of the Vietnam War. And here in the last few days, the reports on the confrontation between Iranian and U.S. vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, very reminiscent in terms of an initial cover story being told with absolute certainty. You tune in CNN, someone like Barbara Starr standing as a correspondent of CNN in the Pentagon and talking about how this happened, that happened. How do we know? It's because it's the Pentagon story that's been put out, reported not by journalism, but by stenography, which is a very different thing. So these patterns that have taken us, and this is just a partial list, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Grenada, Panama, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, the Dominican Republic I left out during the 1960s. And so I felt that the book, War Made Easy, could shine some light on these overall patterns. And then for me, a real bonus as an author, sort of a print guy, is that the Media Education Foundation saw the book a couple of years ago and said, we're going to make a documentary film. They spent more than a year just looking at archival footage, which I, as an author who studied this stuff, found mind-blowing and revelatory. I really had not seen most of this material. I'd read some transcripts. And so we have now the film, War Made Easy. We're fortunate enough that it was narrated by Sean Penn. What was going to be a short film turned out to be a full-length narrative feature at 75 minutes. And it's now showing, had its Seattle premiere, as you mentioned, Mike, last night at the Northwest Film Forum. And I want to invite people tonight because I'll be there again, and it's a chance for us to get together, look at the film together, and then talk about these issues, including the continuing war in Iraq and the way in which we've been spun not only into that war, but looking towards an attack on Iran, which I think is still on the table, although there was various sorts of media messages coming out about it, which point in various directions. So just to kind of underscore that invitation, since we are live, tonight at the Northwest Film Forum on 12th Avenue in Seattle, 1515 12th Avenue, We have a 7 o'clock show and a 9 o'clock show, and we'll follow each one where I'll participate in a Q&A.
So, can you give us some examples of the consistent patterns that you have seen prior to the U.S. going to war?
Yeah, there's an agenda building process, and there's a repertoire. Not all the elements exist each time, but you can find pretty much a commonality, sort of a limited grab bag. Of course, the Vietnam War, North Vietnam was a threat. Ho Chi Minh was compared to Hitler. It was a question of aggression. It was a question of human rights. Then you fast forward, say, the Dominican Republic, well, right after the Gulf of Tonkin, a matter of months, in the spring of 1965, Lyndon Johnson saying, Americans were at risk, which was a theme we were to hear later on about Panama and Grenada, and in 89 in the case of Panama, 83 in the case of the invasion of Grenada. And so it was a sort of bait and switch in that case where Americans' lives are at stake, and then the aggressors, the communists, were trying to subvert democracy in the Dominican Republic, so the Marines went in. Then, as I mentioned, 83 and 89, Grenada was, we were told, about preventing a beachhead for aggression in the case of Grenada. And there is one pattern, too, that while we're told human rights are a big part of the issue, actually the thugs and dictators that are being pointed to are often people who were subsidized by the U.S. government. And so you had Manuel Noriega in 1989, who was being condemned by Washington, even though just in a period of a couple years earlier, he had been in a very close collegial relationship with the president and vice president. And so when there's a falling out, then all of a sudden the good guy is a bad guy. Of course, that happened later with Saddam Hussein, who had very cordial relationships. I write in the book, and now the film has stunning footage of December 1983, Baghdad, a guy named Donald Rumsfeld, representing the Reagan administration of the United States, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, who at the time was engaged in some of his worst horrific human rights atrocities, and yet here was the U.S. government making nice with him, which was a precursor to some very quick onsets of agricultural credits, aid, intelligence assistance in the Iraq war with Iran. And this has really been a pattern. And of course, once the war is underway, in the case of Vietnam and the war in Iraq now, and I talk about this a lot in the book, it's emphasized in the film because of where we are now. You can't cut and run. That was a term that Lyndon Johnson used. It's a term we're hearing now from the President of the United States, George W. Bush, and many pundits and supporters. And so you have to wonder, how much has changed under the sun? These are very similar sorts of pitches for starting a war and continuing it.
Do you know how many or situations there where incidents were essentially manufactured or created or exaggerated?
Well, yeah, they're manufactured, created, spun, as you say, exaggerated, and that's been very, very frequent. You need these incidents to sort of buck up the media outrage. And so, for instance, people may remember shortly before the invasion of Panama in '89, there was a naval officer and his wife, and she was pushed around, and obscene comments were made towards her. And so, in a sense, the war was then a way to assuage her honor, And it was, now we may look back, we say, well, that was kind of camp or corny, or gee, couldn't they think of something better? But at the time, it got huge play back in 1989. And, of course, we have all sorts of incidents after and before the war takes place. Let's remember the babies in the incubators who we were told were absolutely ripped from their incubators, large numbers of them, hundreds of them. It turned out there weren't that many incubators in the country of Kuwait, but we had this tearful testimony on Capitol Hill that the occupying Iraqi troops had torn these babies from incubators in Kuwait City. Well, it turned out that the young woman giving that account was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. It was all concocted. It was all a lie put together by a PR agency with the connivance of pro-war members of Congress and the administration. And the net effect is that got enormous play in the United States and helped turn Operation Desert Shield into so-called Operation Desert Storm. So the troops were being mobilized in the Middle East, and with those sorts of outrages being falsely reported, it helped gin up the war machinery to then say, okay, we have to start the Gulf War in 91, which of course is what happened.
That particular example you gave of the incubators and babies, was that the first time that a PR firm had been pulled in to do something like that?
Well, it was maybe the most egregious example, but PR has been very much part of the operation for a long time. It used to be more in-house. Now there's a tendency to also hire the public relations agency. There's a lot of that going on, and it's very difficult even to see where journalism ends and PR begins, because so much of what we're getting is paid for spin, very carefully mapped out. It's a function of reliance on official sources by journalists, as well as just the effect of dumping millions of dollars into PR campaigns.
And is there always been a consistent pattern of the corporate media rolling over and just repeating anything they're told, or is there any times that they've actually investigated what's been going on?
Well, we have individual instances of very good investigative reporting, and let's give a nod in the last couple of years to Seymour Hersh at the New Yorker magazine. But the problem with exceptions is that they're exceptional, and it's the essence of routine that is all about the propaganda, the drumbeat, the code words, the catchphrases. And Saddam Hussein killing his own people was a major theme. Very little mention of the U.S. role there. And by repetition, which is a really powerful element of war propaganda, the themes are drummed in, and people begin to accept the notion that war is, the film goes into, inevitable. And once people get the idea it's inevitable, there's a tendency to perhaps reluctantly go along with it. Yugoslavia and the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, a good example, because the talk about ethnic cleansing was based on reality, but what was not talked about is that the U.S. had winked at and encouraged ethnic cleansing of the Serbs in the Krajina in 1996. Bill Clinton, as president, actually praising what was called Operation Storm, where the troops of Franjo Tuđman went in, and Misha Glenny of the BBC reporting that Serbs were being shot, as he said, like rabbits. Well, this was a precursor to the kind of ethnic cleansing that went on in Kosovo in very early 1999. Carl Bildt, the Swedish diplomat, who I quote in the War Made Easy book, said at the time in 96, if we're going to approve or tacitly accept this ethnic cleansing in the Krajina of Serbs, then what's to stop Milosevic sending in his thugs in Kosovo? And so it's the double standard here that is often what underlies and then, from a moral standpoint, truly undermines claims to human rights virtue in terms of U.S. military action.
All right, so there are repeated themes that the people in power choose, I guess, from a wide buffet of those. What are the elements in the U.S. that they have to win over to be able to go to war? Would that just be the U.S. population and Congress?
Well, because we have significant elements of democracy in this country, it's very important what people think, what they do and don't do. If we lived in a dictatorship, it wouldn't matter much what people think. So the PR, the media campaigns are really essential. The public has to be won over, certainly, to prevent large-scale opposition as a war is being hatched. And Congress, at least Congress to be inactive, Congress to go along with it, arm twisting, and that has historically happened, whether Congress is simply a passive entity, or in the case of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, or the resolution before the Gulf War, or the invasion of Iraq, there's an effort to actually get a vote.
But it would seem, as well as with the public, that the opposition here prior to, let's say, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was fairly stiff.
Yeah.
But that didn't seem to matter.
Well, it's a matter, it's sort of a war of propaganda in terms of how much pushback is effective. And people were in the streets, if you add up the numbers, into the millions, really, in the months leading up to the invasion of Iraq in our own country, as well as that one day, February 15th, 2003, an estimated 10 million people protesting on the same day against the impending invasion. You had some courageous members of Congress speaking out, including Jim McDermott here out of Seattle. But the powerful machinery to set an agenda for war is something that I think unless we can counteract, it tends to prevail. I looked for examples and really couldn't find them of a president who really had decided we should go to war. The U.S. should be dragged into war. I can't find an instance where that president was stymied by Congress. If you look at the Constitution, though, Congress has the power to appropriate the power of the purse, and that's been turned upside down. One of the key themes of the War Made Easy film is with stunning footage of two real heroes in Congress around this question of presidential prerogatives. 1964, one of two people, along with Ernest Greening of Alaska, to vote against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Wayne Morse. And to see the footage is really chilling and stunning because he was so articulate about the reality that the Constitution gives to the people of the United States the determination of foreign policy. And through the Congress, not the president. The president, as Senator Morse said, is the administrator of the people's foreign policy. And yet we've been propagandized to believe that it's really the choice of the president, and the Congress becomes kind of a bystander. We have the same issue now in terms of the war in Iraq, a possible attack on Iran. The War Made Easy film has this really very powerful footage of Representative Barbara Lee, the only member of the House or Senate to vote against the bloody blank check after 9/11 on September 14th, 2001, to say, President Bush, go at it. Whatever you think you got to do militarily in response to 9/11, go ahead and do it. It was only Barbara Lee who stood up, and her 1 minute she was allowed on the House floor is in the film. And I hope people will watch the film, and just for that, if nothing else. But one of the things she says is, let us not become the evil that we deplore. And I would argue that that has largely happened, that her prophetic voice, ignored in a kind of a Cassandra way, has really been unfortunately verified by events.
So when Congressman Morris and Barbara Lee both spoke out against the wars, how did the media cover both of those?
Well, Senator Morse, as the senior senator from Oregon, had a pretty big national profile, and he was largely dismissed as a crank. I mean, he was a guy, a law professor, a learned scholar, a real student of international affairs and constitutional law in the United States, and he was largely set aside. The entire White House, and of course, at that point, Senator Morse was a Democrat. Lyndon Johnson, of course, a Democrat. And he was challenging the president from his own party. And so he wasn't given a lot of space. He was so far outside the conventional wisdom. Barbara Lee had so many death threats that she had to have armed guards protecting her. She was vilified by the Fox and other right-wing entities who despised her for speaking up against this resolution after 9/11. Now, in the light of history, when you see the footage, you see this woman saw what was coming. She said, let's prevent this from spiraling out of control. And yet that's what has happened. You have several thousand Americans dead. You have hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead. You have the Afghanistan situation in which, people say, well, that's a good war. I want to know why. What has been accomplished by the bombing and now the fighting in Afghanistan? We have several thousand just in the first few months of that attack on Afghanistan. You have several thousand documented Afghan civilians killed by the U.S. attacks. And for what? It's because after 9/11, there was a very strong visceral reaction. Somebody's got to pay for this. Well, who? It wasn't the people who propagated the attack. Osama bin Laden is still running around. A CIA assessment in 2002 by the summer of that year said that, if anything, al-Qaeda had been strengthened by the U.S. attack on Afghanistan. So I think it goes to what Martin Luther King described as, in his words, the madness of militarism, that there's a sense that it's therapeutic to lash out, but what are the long-term effects? Are we or anybody else really better off after virtually 5 years now of a war in Iraq? I don't think so.
Are entities like and concepts of embedding journalists with troops in Iraq and entities like the Fox network, are those relatively new to getting these wars going?
Well, there's been a bit of a pendulum. I mean, at times like the invasion of Panama, the or then the Gulf War in early 1991, the troops have been far away from the U.S. Soldiers. As a matter of fact, during so-called Operation Desert Storm, the TV coverage was largely co-produced by the Pentagon, which decided what footage would go on the U.S. networks. The embedding process is sort of the opposite end of that, but it ends up with a similar effect. On the surface, embedding was freedom for journalists to report, but in fact they were embedded psychologically as well as logistically. They bonded with the troops. The war was presented overwhelmingly through the eyes of the invaders and occupiers, not from those being invaded and occupied. And so you didn't have, by and large, U.S. journalists being embedded with those at the other end of the cruise missiles, only among those who were firing the cruise missiles, and so on and so forth. The film goes into this in some depth because it was one of the great myths that we were presented with it. Yes, you're getting the truth now on television and so forth because of the embedding process.
So, what have the proponents of war learned over the 40 years? Have they been changing their strategy dramatically? And what, if anything, have opponents to war learned in the last 40 years?
Well, I think, there's been increased sophistication along the spectrum of people who have views about going to war and staying to war. I think that people who are skeptical and critical have become, by and large, more sophisticated about preparation for war, the machinery to propagandize for war, as the saying goes, truth being the first casualty of war. But also those who are selling war have become more adept and sophisticated as well. And the advent of cable television has been very important. If you look at just something as simple as naming a war, Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, that is the lower third of the screen quite often. And just branding a war has been useful. The nonstop briefings during the Gulf War, for instance, or the weeks of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, these are techniques very, very useful, especially when we have a pretty compliant press on the whole that is critical from a tactical standpoint, but not the fundamental questions of the truthfulness of the rationales for war and the underlying prerogatives of the U.S. government to attack a country on the say-so of the president.
So, what do you hope to accomplish with your book and film?
Well, the War Made Easy film has been exciting because it brings to the screen in a way that's for people intellectually and emotionally engaging. And so with the premiere here in Seattle this week, it's a part of a sort of a launch across the country of education and activism and raising these questions. The film is going to open in New York March 14th at the Quad Theater, which is a big venue, and it's really not something we expected. This was an educational film, and it was going to be 35 minutes. Now it's 75 minutes or so, and it's had its own life, and we really, at the time now where we're just about to mark the 5th anniversary of the Iraq invasion, the film's being used really as a tool of provocation, if you will, to raise these questions, and we'll see what comes of it.
And based on the examples you give in the book and in the film, again, we started out where you mentioned Iran and the recent incidents with the 5 boats and the U.S. ships. How close are we on potential U.S. invasion or attack there?
Well, I really think, so to speak, the flagstones are being laid for the path to war. And people say, oh, well, there aren't enough U.S. troops. Well, it's really not necessarily about U.S. troops. The U.S. was engaged in bombing Yugoslavia for 78 straight days in 1999, did not lose a single U.S. serviceman or woman in that process from any military actions. And it's quite feasible for the U.S. to launch a major air attack on Iran, and there's certainly political motivation from Cheney and Bush to do that. So I think it's, we don't know what's going to happen, but I think that the danger is definitely there.
Finally, I saw in an article, I think it was a San Francisco Examiner or Chronicle, where you kind of have another battle or potential battle with your film in terms of fair use. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yes, the Media Education Foundation, as a nonprofit, believes very firmly, and I agree with the people there, that history should not belong to anyone. That if we're going to critique and portray our history, we can't ask Fox News for permission to use their footage. We can't use footage only if we get permission when it's the floor of the U.S. House or Senate. So, from fair use being the outlook, we have included a lot of footage that might have been difficult otherwise to get permission for or access to. So this is a fair use film, and some people don't like that, but in 15 years of putting out a total of 50 films, MEF, Media Education Foundation, has never been successfully sued. So we are asserting that right, because if you don't use it, you lose it.
All right, and people can probably stay abreast of that you have multiple websites.
Yeah, an easy one is just warmadeeasy.com, and that will lead you then to the film site and so forth, warmadeeasy.com. And also, I think that if people go from there, they can see a trailer of the film, which is sometimes helpful.
Still have about 2 minutes left. What would you recommend to opponents of wars that they need to watch out for and or do when they see the warning signs that you've laid out in your book and your film?
Well, I think fatalism is always, so to speak, fatal, that if people are passive, they accept that, gee, it's inevitable or going to happen. The passivity increases the likelihood it will happen. If we do believe in democracy, and I think there is a sort of a acculturated belief in it, whatever layers of cynicism, then we've got to keep active and be assertive. And whether you live in Seattle or anywhere else, if we don't utilize the First Amendment, it's going to wither away in practice. And the issues of war and peace are really front and center, as Martin Luther King said, and his voice is in the film. The society that year after year spends more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death, and we see the results in our own communities.
Yeah, I believe I read that one of the terms you used in an interview you did was restrained by our own caution.
Yeah, it's very much a passivity that's acculturated, and of course it's much appreciated by the war planners in Washington.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in this morning.
Oh, thank you.